Hello, everyone. I'm sorry that I couldn't be there in person with you. I had some visa issues that didn't allow travel. And so I'm joining you at 6 a.m. And so it's really dark here. And, if I say something that's not entirely coherent, please, I apologize in advance. So I want to talk a little bit about agrarian labor and social reproduction in the global south. And you have spent at least 2 days talking about social reproduction, both in terms of the debates as well as how people have used them in different contexts. And I want to continue in that vein. And what you probably have already inferred is that there are different ways in which people talk about social reproduction. There are different ways in which people have used social reproduction. And just as importantly, that its application varies both based on the sector, if I can call it the sector, but also in terms of the place. And what that is something that I want to kind of emphasize today. So let's start. I want to frame this conversation in terms of crisis. We've been talking about crisis globally. We've been talking about crisis in various ways. When the 2007-8 economic crisis that originated in the US but hit very hard different parts of the world, people talked about it as the triple crisis of finance, food, climate change. In the last 2-3 years, people have been talking about it as the triple C crisis of COVID, conflict, and climate change. And of course, those interested on talking about it as a planetary crisis of climate change, pollution, biodiversity loss, etc. But I really want us to go, how do we frame all of these crises? Because, for those living in the global south, and particularly when we talk about the working classes in the global south, not just global south, which is the formerly colonized countries in the 3 continents of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, but also if we think about all of the marginalized communities, even within the global north, Europe and North America, like these are crises that people have been facing at various times, depending on the circumstance. So I want to invite us to think about it as a crisis of social reproduction, and then in that context talk about agrarian labor and agrarian economies as well. So I want to start with a little story, and then I will kind of frame, what specific questions we need to be thinking about. And the story takes place on April 18th. Well, the story really starts, like decades, generations earlier, but the story culminates in on April 18th, 2020, in India, when a 12-year-old girl, Jamlo Makdam, and she worked in the chili fields of a state, or chili pepper fields in the state of, in a southern state. And during COVID, when the federal government or the central government imposed a very brutal lockdown, she had to flee. She could not work. And she lived really far away in central India. And I'm sorry, I should have also put a map of India in the slide, but she was, she started to walk home because she had no wages, she had no place to, and if you if you don't have wages, you can't pay rent. And she really wanted to get home, as a 12-year-old, those circumstances were very, very, even as adults, we were, taken aback, and some of us found it hard to adjust. So she walked about 150 kilometers in 3 days before succumbing to exhaustion and dehydration, about less than 50 kilometers from her home. So So, ostensibly the story is one of the incompetency of the federal government and the state government that did not plan for safe and affordable transportation of the more than 50 million low-wage migrant workers engaged in informal work who are desperate to return home. But we can also think of it as a story of the economy that does not provide for workers. We can think of, and not just that it doesn't provide for workers, it doesn't provide decent employment. It's a story of a state that does not ensure that not just workers, but all people are guaranteed decent wages and job security. It's a state that does not implement child labor laws or guarantee adequate social safety net to the residents. And really, it's a story of the vast majority of the working people, not just in India, but across the world, who survive on labor from their, from their families, from their communities. And very often this labor is gendered. And that the capitalist economy, as well as the state, take this for granted. And it really represents in a very stark way and a very chilling way. And I'm kind of having goosebumps as I'm even talking about her and thinking about her. In a very stark way, it says something about the exhaustion of sort of the working classes, right? And the story that I offered is just one story in India, but really there are so many other similar stories that vary in intensity, that vary in sort of its, like people were shocked when, all of us were shocked when we read this story in the news and it was reported in the news. But, it's just extraordinary. It's just one extraordinary instance of the everyday struggles of the working classes. So how do we think about crisis? And Nancy Fraser talks about, or interprets, or talks about a crisis of care in terms of time poverty, in terms of, the contradictions that exist in social reproduction, and that it's systemic, and in the current form of capitalism and capitalist society. And then Federici also talks about this crisis of care, which I will refer to later on as well. And she talks about the crisis, attributing it to a range of different things: social programs, extractivism, warfare, etc., etc. But what I want us to do is also kind of think about it in the context of the global South. So that's sort of what I am going to turn towards. So in terms of this session, both before the break and after the break, and so the way we will structure this is, because I was informed that there might be load shedding, that I'm going to speak for about an hour, hour and a half. Between an hour and a half, we'll keep the remaining time for Q&A. So if you do have questions, by all means, if you want to stop me as I'm speaking, please do. But otherwise, we'll also leave some time at the end of these 2 hours to have a discussion, and take some questions. And then after the break, I have planned exercise for you that you can do irrespective of whether I am able to join you or not. So in terms of the questions for this session, well, how should we think about this, right? So I want us to think about, in the global South, right? So formerly colonized countries, one of the things in terms of in the post-colonial period, one of the overwhelming questions was, how do we catch up with the rest, right? Or how do we catch up with the West? And the one way, or a dominant way that the catch up was supposed to happen is to engage in an agrarian transition, where people predominantly would be working in a much more industrialized sector as opposed to an agrarian sector. And some economists and many people believe that to be the case even now. And the idea is that the wage economy is really sort of central, and this becomes part of in some ways the myth of the theories that we are offered. And so I want us to be able to challenge that in the context of the Global South. And then I want to talk about what contributes to gender inequities in agrarian economies. And then finally, I want us to take these two questions and really think about how can we, are there different ways of constructing a theoretical framework that might be more suitable to the Global South? I will offer these just as one way, and then kind of leave you to think about, what holes might exist even in the way that I'm offering. Now, as I talk about the Global South, and you already know this, but I just want to preface this anyway, is that this is a very large, sort of group of people, right? Like people who live in the Global South, right? And even in any one particular nation, the level of diversity, both across time and across space, is quite tremendous. So in some ways, we're doing a lot of abstraction now. And the abstraction is meant not to suggest that this is the only way, but that, to offer a mental model, which then you will take back to your specific context and try and make sense of that context using some of these mental models. In some ways, you might reject them completely. In other ways, they might actually be useful and illuminate something. So the first question that I want to ask is this about the wage economy. Is that the only source of livelihood, right? So how do people make a living under capitalism in the Global South? So, in many countries that were formerly colonized, one of the impositions of the colonial regime was to engage in specialization of specialization in specific agricultural products that can be used by the colonial countries as raw materials. The other thing that the colonies offered was, of course, labor. So post, once independence, once political independence was fought and won, one of the questions that emerged was this thing called the agrarian question. And we now call this the classical agrarian question as the agrarian question of capital, because the question was, in terms of what is the role of agriculture and how is that going to help us catch up with the rest? As I already mentioned, the idea was that catching up with the rest would require a significant amount of industrialization. And so, but the colonies or the former colonies were, many of them, not all of them, were specialized in agricultural production. So the conversation began to be drawing from sort of historical examples of what happened in Europe. The conversation began to be that, look, maybe the agricultural sector or the agrarian sector could provide the economy with surplus that can be, and by surplus, I mean profits, you can think of surplus as profits, with profits that can be invested into the industrial sector and hence grow the economy in that way, because the colonies had just won political independence and they didn't necessarily want to immediately depend on the colonizing countries for investment. So this question about investment. Now, fast forward to 90s, 2000s, under this whole new world of economic liberalization, you began to see that the agrarian sector didn't necessarily wasn't as required for the development of the industrial sector in some of these countries of the three continents. And so people began to question whether the agrarian question is even relevant, or is it just not relevant? Is the agrarian sector not relevant anymore because, economies, industrial economies are being funded by investment from outside, or what we often call as foreign direct investment. It's being funded by sort of capitalists within urban and industrial sectors themselves. And so perhaps the agrarian economy itself is not relevant anymore. There also began to be a question about, well, even if there is a emerging industrial sector within these economies of the global South, what about labor itself? Right? How do we characterize labor? Are all the workers just engaged in wage labor? Are they all part of the proletariat? Or are there various other forms of proletarianization? Is it, how do we characterize the workers themselves? How do we characterize the peasants or the former peasants or the small peasants and this entire class of what Isa Shivji refers to as the working people? So we know, for instance, that Jaji Sikata talks about how in Kenya and Uganda and South Africa, that family farms itself became extremely capitalized, and they often drew workers, both urban and rural workers, and particularly women workers as employees. And this enabled some people to get a livelihood, right? But we also know that those jobs were not necessarily, were low-wage jobs, in some ways dead-end jobs. There's no possibility for advancement. And so the question is, why engage in these jobs? What are these options, right? What are the other options? So some other people, both in different parts of the three continents, started to engage in home-based work. So they, you've just completed a session on the informal economy, and you've probably just discussed all of the different ways that the informal economy operates. Extremely important, particularly for women workers in India, but also South Africa, Zimbabwe, elsewhere. We also know that that in order to survive, that people in, drawing from Sikata's work, that people in Zimbabwe were not just engaged in farming, but they were also relying on relatives in rural areas. They would often offer food items to relatives in urban areas in return for financial support. In Ghana, many income earning activities had an agricultural base, or they were engaged in trading, and that all of these activities were quite dependent on land and natural resources, right? That as much as for those people who were migrating away from rural areas and away from agrarian economies, that they still continue to be extremely rooted to those agrarian economies in rural areas. And this is also true of India as well, that, in terms of migration, that there is this circular, what is known as a circular migration, where people migrate away from their villages, but they don't migrate permanently. They migrate for short periods and return back. And so the rural agrarian economy continues to be extremely important in terms of livelihoods. So as much as people kind of talk about wage labor, that we also have to think about all of these different ways in which people have not been fully incorporated into the wage market or the labor market, and that this condition of being a semi-proletariat has been one of the dominant features of the formerly colonized countries, or the three continents of Latin America, Asia, and Africa, for various reasons, partly to do with colonialism, partly to do with the legacy that colonialism has left behind, and then partly to do with sort of the power and hierarchical structures that exist within those economies that have prevented have prevented this kind of emergence of emergence of people out of cycles of poverty. one of the things that the semi-proletariat ends up doing is that it absorbs the cost of reproduction, right? So that as much as wage labor is able to give us or give people some ways of buying commodities, that all of these different other forms of survival, of livelihood, also kind of play a huge role. And part of these different livelihoods also are ways in which women's labor or gendered labor continues to engage in production for subsistence, whether that is in terms of farming small plots, whether it is kind of taking on various forms of informal labor, whether that is fetching water, whether that's fetching firewood so that you don't have to buy it from the market. All of these are different forms of production that don't get counted not only in official statistics, but also in terms of our everyday discourse and our everyday conversations. This doesn't always appear in people's imagination, doesn't appear in conversations about policymaking, etc. So this question, the agrarian question of whether, or the question of whether the agrarian economy can contribute to capitalist development in the three continents, or in Asia and Africa and Latin America, also then converted to the agrarian question of labor. What do we do with labor? How do we understand all of these different forms of labor? So Marxist historian Jairus Banerjee actually argues that wage labor, just as an aside, the reason, so in India, for instance, one of the big debates in the 80s, 70s and 80s was also the question of how do you characterize the economy? Is it a capitalist economy, or is it an economy or a society that continues to be semi-feudal in various ways? And that was a huge debate. So apart from the question of, what is the role of the agrarian economy in capitalist development, with the idea that capitalist development will then benefit everyone and will lift people up in terms of their standards of living, the other question was, how do we actually characterize the economies themselves, right? And one of the arguments in India was that, look, we don't actually have wage labor is not the dominant form, and hence perhaps it's not capitalism. So in response, Marxist historian Banerjee argues that wage labor represents one of many different forms of exploitation and capitalism. And so you have to think about wage labor in conjunction with various forms of labor. And then Isa Shivji also argues that, based on Walter Rodney's work and his own writings from the 1980s on Tanzania, that that there's a need for a shift in how we understand what the peasants are experiencing, that they are in fact experiencing exploitation under capitalism, even as they continue to be even as they continue to operate in ways that might form, or there might seem that there is continuity in pre-capitalist forms, right? That they experience exploitation in addition to oppression under capitalism, and what that does is in some ways reduces their ability to consume. Though I'll keep coming back to this notion of consumption, not because I want to talk about consumption in terms of conspicuous consumption or the kind of advertising fueled, social media fueled consumption frenzy, but remember that we are talking about economies and societies where many people don't even reach the minimum threshold of consumption, which is necessary for survival. So conventional wisdom has tended to assume that subsistence good production reduces once the economy develops and the state provides adequate social safety net. And this has certainly been the case in many advanced economies where women's role has primarily been in care activities, not exclusively, but and these care activities themselves form a significant proportion of total GDP. But if you talk about economies in the global south, women still significantly engaged in domestic production and unpaid services, because there is, and not because, and some of this is backbreaking work. So I don't by any means want to romanticize this work. That this is not easy work at all, but they continue to engage in this production for consumption in the absence of living wages and in the absence of adequate state intervention. So in these economies, these kind of, and I'm using very broad brush strokes, as much as capitalism has flourished, has emerged, has, taken on different forms in these economies, it has also simultaneously encouraged or benefited from these non-waged labor processes. And, later on, I will talk about the difference between waged labor and non-waged labor and how they're interconnected, and how they, in fact, become quite crucial in thinking about social reproduction. But what I want to emphasize here is that capitalism benefits from all of these labor processes, right? Whether those are in the labor reserves of sub-Saharan Africa, or in Latin America, or in India and other parts of South Asia. So in addition to capitalism depending on these non-wage labor processes, in the context of social reproduction, what's most important is that the working classes, or what Shivji refers to as the working people themselves, cannot entirely rely on capitalist development to engage, to satisfy their consumption requirements, or to satisfy the requirements for social reproduction. So they engage in these non-wage labor processes for survival, and to the extent that people can flourish and, kind of improve their lives. So what this has done, of course, is that there's a very high dependence on land and other natural commons, which I know from the schedule that you will discuss tomorrow, I think. So, but just very quickly, I just want to say that according to one account in 2016, about 77% of households in the global south engage in wild food production and wild food collection from forests and non-forest commons, right? And another 6 to 44% of total imputed household income. So imputed household income is basically, there are so many non-market, so many instances of non-market production that don't go through the, are not priced, right? So economists have developed a way of imputing a value to it based on, what is the market rate of labor and so on. And then they try and derive how much of this thing that doesn't go through the market, what is its value in market terms. And according to one estimate, across the global south, in different countries in the global south, the amount of income that households derive from the natural commons varies anywhere between 6 to 44%. So in some economies, and perhaps in some communities, in some economies, this dependence is extremely low, but in some other places, it's extremely high. And a lot of this labor that goes into collecting firewood, or collecting wild foods, or collecting, all sorts of things from the natural commons, is unpaid and invisible labor. But in many countries, it's also labor that is gendered, right? So the point that I want to make is that that there is all of this diversity that exists within the global south in terms of, and not across countries in the global south, but even specific economies, whether those are national economies, whether those are regional economies or local economies, in terms of how people kind of make a living. And in the work that I have done on India with Smriti Rao, looking at, all of these different labor processes, what we found that even as people get classified as wage workers, or even as they get classified as salaried workers, or even as they get classified as predominantly as engaging in agriculture, that there's even among those classifications, people engage in multiple and varied labor processes of production as well as reproduction, both men and women, right? So, and in India, this is particularly important because despite sort of, India touting itself as as one of the countries in the global south that is emerging and, is kind of, major player in the global economy, primarily because of its economic growth. This growth itself is a growth that is jobless, right? Actually, Kannan and Ravindran, the people that I cite, actually go even further and say that it's not jobless or growth that has not created jobs, but a growth under which jobs have been lost. So particularly for women, and I'm sorry that I didn't talk about the job, in the slide it says jobless as opposed to job loss, but really they're talking about how for women particularly, that in a period between 2010 to 2016, that there was a tremendous amount of job loss, particularly for women, and women lost about 21 million jobs in that period without, and most of these jobs lost were in the agrarian economy because agriculture had become feminized. A lot of women were working in agriculture, but so they have lost these jobs, and there wasn't a subsequent creation of jobs in the non-agrarian economy, whether in rural or urban areas, right? So they lost jobs, that's fine, but there was no other job, any other job waiting for them. So this has significantly affected women. So they estimate, Kannan and Ravindran, estimate that the shortfall is to the tune of 116%. And this also includes, for instance, not just women workers who already existed in the labor market, but, as, every year you have a new infusion as people kind of move into the working age category, right? So they are able to work, they might even want to work, but there are no jobs, and hence they do not. I just want to pause and make sure that there are no questions, but, if there are, please do, if at all that's possible, and, do post it in the chat. And if it's not, then, please write them down, and I'll take up those questions at the end of, me talking. So just what I said is that there are multiple labor regimes, and that subsistence agriculture and allied production is still very dominant in urban and rural areas. Even when wage labor, when people have access to wage labor, that wage labor is in the informal sector, not necessarily in the formal sector. Again, I'm sure you've had some extensive conversations about this in the previous session, in terms of why, informal labor itself is quite problematic in the global south. In India, the extent of informal labor is above 80%, usually this labor is, doesn't have very many benefits, is characterized by low wages, and women typically are reluctant to engage in informal labor because there is this additional issue of sexual harassment and being unable to bargain for reasonable wages and so on, right? So, and again, that's probably true elsewhere as well, and we know that people have written about it, right? So in any case, what I want to emphasize is that there are these multiple labor regimes that exist, and they exist in different parts of the global south, and that, in the three continents, Africa, Asia, and Latin America, we still see significant instances or significant expression of people engaged in subsistence production, subsistence agriculture, as well as relying on the natural commons to engage in these kinds of subsistence production. So in talking about the Global South, then the work that I have done with Lynn Osome, we have characterized this labor, right? That there is an agrarian question of, we've gone from an agrarian question of capital, how can the agrarian economy contribute to capitalist development, to an agrarian question of labor. How do we even understand all of these, these vast reserves of labor that continue to be somehow rooted to the agrarian economy, to us, very kind of stridently asking for a recognition that it's not just an agrarian question of labor, but we also have to talk about the agrarian question of gendered labor. And the agrarian question of gendered labor matters, particularly because as much as, there is this reliance on agriculture or on agrarian economies among the working people, that so much of this reliance is on gendered labor or women's labor, and that it kind of keeps households and communities going, right? And that across all of the different labor processes, and I'll talk about, what I mean by different labor processes in just a little bit, that, whether we are talking about informal work, whether we are talking about formal work, whether we are talking about subsistence production, etc., that women continue to bear this responsibility of reproductive labor and continue to bear the responsibility of ensuring that households reach some minimum level of consumption. And so, how women end up doing that is quite, kind of, fascinating, but also, the respect one needs to have for, sort of women's ingenuity that's born out of, deep need and has and can have tremendous impact on their physical and mental health, and their inability to explore the kinds of options that, other options that they might have in life, right? So I'll come back to this notion of agrarian question of gendered labor. So I want to then go back to the second question. What contributes to gender inequities in agrarian economies? And I want to talk about it again, of course, in the context of the Global South. So, how do we think about, if you're talking about agrarian economies, we know that one of the things that happened under colonialism was that land itself became a commodity that was being snatched away. People were dispossessed. People were displaced, and that these land regimes imposed by colonialism are not just represented a way for increased production and profit making for the colonial powers, but it also represented a control of labor and sexuality of women and other economically and socially oppressed minorities. Now, after in the post-colonial regimes, excuse me, I just needed a drink of water. Many land and peasant movements were successful in underscoring the importance of land reform, right? So, and this was met with varying levels of success, and it forced some post-colonial states to adopt and implement policies that would upset the economic hierarchy. Now, across the board, however, these land reforms that were undertaken between the 1950s and 1970s in non-socialist states were pretty much impervious to the concerns of gender equity, right? So in the 1980s, there were some vociferous demands for land reform from rural peasant movements and particularly in Latin America, like countries like Brazil and Colombia. And the demands that peasants were making for land reform were included demands to title women beneficiaries, both either individually or through joint titling of households. Right, but in many other parts of the world, these efforts at land reform pretty much excluded women, and kind of fed into this, or drew from the breadwinner model, which I think you might have already encountered this term, the breadwinner model, being that you have the breadwinner, usually the male head of the household, and so you want to ensure that all opportunities, and I'm kind of paraphrasing it, and there is a lot more complexity to the breadwinner model, but the idea being that you want to ensure that the male head of the household primarily has all the opportunities to ensure that the household does well. And so you don't necessarily pay attention to sort of the opportunities created for women in the household and women in the communities, right? So so a lot of different things happened in the 1980s and 1990s, but one of the things that emerged was Beena Agarwal, who is a feminist economist from India, currently in the UK, wrote this kind of book that had such a significant impact on how people thought about women's rights to land. So on the one hand, you had these demands that were emerging from peasant and other social movements themselves. But on the other hand, in the academic sphere, you have this book called A Field of One's Own, where she argues that women need to have their own land, and that this land and land titling is extremely, or access to land, either titled or not, but you need to have access to land. And she argues for titling, but you also need access to it. That this a field of one's own, having access to one's own land for women would be associated with a higher economic security. It would reduce the gender gap in command over property, and that this would represent not only having access to the means of production and reproduction, but it would also then provide women with access to credit, respect, and that it would also increase their women's bargaining power within the household as well as the community. So she argued that there's always been a focus on basic needs such as education, health of women, but that it's equally important to focus on giving land rights to women in policy formulations. And she and another feminist economist from Latin America, Carmen Diane-Dier, really challenge, and I'm just giving you two examples, right? There's a whole host of people who've written about this, but both of them really played a huge role in challenging the idea of the family as a single entity, and that those benefits get equally distributed, right? And between them, there was also some differences on how to think about titling. Should it be individual titling? Should it, can the male and the female head of the households, could they engage in joint titling and all of that? So there were all these different kind of debates that were happening, but the idea being that land or access to land is important, right? And so there were significant advances in gender equity in titling, whether in through constitutional and legislative reforms. And just to back up a little bit, in the 1990s or mid 1990s, what also happened was that there was something called the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, which was organized by UN Women in 1995, and it provided a very important agenda and policy document for women's empowerment and gender equality. And it really pushed this idea that that gender equity is important, and that became something that people started to adopt. And what what I will do in just a slide is also question the ways in which they get adopted, right? So, this Beijing Declaration was signed by 184 countries. And since then, countries have demonstrated varying degrees of commitment to adopting and implementing gender equitable legislations, regulations, and policies. And you see some of these benefits, in terms of titling as well, whether we are talking about Brazilian and South African transitions, we're talking about titling, dual-headed household titling in some parts of Latin America, and change in inheritance laws more recently in the last decade or so, a change in inheritance laws that impacts Hindu women and whether they would have access to inherit, whether they have a share in inherited property or not. Previously, there were no laws guaranteeing that for Hindu women, not necessarily for women of other religious backgrounds. Very quickly, different religions have different personal codes and personal laws that are recognizable under the Indian legal system. So let's see. Okay, so part of this adopting of gender equity also became evident in the ways that agencies and institutions in adopting a neoliberal policy also started to think about gender equity, right? So you also began to have in different parts of the world, people arguing for market-led agrarian reform, which would mean that you would have to buy land as opposed to land would be redistributed, and that you would, in buying land, you would ensure that everyone was adequately compensated. And some of you will recognize this even in, for instance, in Zimbabwe, and I'll talk about the Zimbabwe case in just a little bit, but, also in South Africa and, other places, right? That, like if you want land reform, you don't redistribute it, but you buy it, and hence you adequately compensate the original land owner. And so they are not entirely left without land, even if they were large landowners and, had were part of the concentration of power and economic benefits. So the question then is, what is this relationship between land and labor, right? Do women themselves have access to labor? This is something that Georgie Sikata calls to question, right? So even if you engage in titling, do they have access to labor? Because in order for land to be productive, you need labor to work the land, right? So Sikata talks about how, men, for instance, are in a position to call on the labor for others, right? So they have these conjugal, part of the conjugal contract is to draw on women's labor, whereas women, on the other hand, even if they receive titles to land, often struggle with labor deficits. Where they have children and where they can engage those children in labor on the farm. They might be sorted if they can buy labor from the market, if they can hire people, and by buy labor, I mean labor time. If they can hire people from the market, then they are set. But, often they struggle with, inadequate resources to hire labor, or in some cases, they don't want to transgress the traditional sexual division of labor in agriculture, right? Then, Carmen Diandier further argues, again, I'm just giving you examples of people who have discussed this. There have, in fact, been a whole host of people who have discussed and talked about various issues that I am presenting to you today. And so Carmen Diandier also kind of questioned, outside, apart from labor, what about access to other means of production, right? So whether that is credit, whether that is having resources to buy other forms of input into production, where are those resources? Do women have access to those resources, right? And that having access or not, so these having access to these means of production, or whether they don't, then that will depend. That will determine whether or not they're compelled into capitalist class relationships, right? So in what ways do they kind of manage, having access to land, having a land title, but in what ways do they actually manage this production and production? And then, how the other question is, how do you balance, right? So as much as women might end up with land titles, how would they then balance the demands of of reproductive labor? So all of the care work, all of the other sort of work that are supposed, are historically seen as the preserve of women, right? So how do you, who's actually going to pick up on all of that, right? So, there are, of course, arguments that have discounted land as an issue for livelihoods, and they particularly have resonance in countries with the history of settler colonialism and high levels of land concentration. In those, countries, those nations, people have found other ways to survive or not survive, as the case may be. But this position itself is a kind of a narrow consideration of what constitutes a land tenure problem, right? So broader focus on the processes of economic liberalization, the erosion of communal principles in land tenure, looking at pockets of land concentration, increased competition for land in urban as well as peri-urban, in rural as well as semi-rural areas, the volume of land conflicts, all of this suggests that even in context of relatively abundant land, there are issues of tenure security. Like people don't, whether they have titles or not, they don't feel secure in their access to land, right? And in their access to land on favorable terms, or terms that are favorable for their ability to engage in production or reproduction, or to engage in their livelihood activities. That, so what I'm trying to do then is trying to complicate a little bit this relationship between land titling, purchasing land, having, or having access to land, and, what does that actually achieve? So, there are other problems too, right? So, and problems in quotes, because as much as we think of land rights and land regimes, we often think of it in a particular way that it has been inherited again from the colonizing forces, right? So we think about it in terms of individual property rights, but individual property rights then butt heads against the complex nature of customary rights in Africa, community rights, and overlapping regimes in Latin America and South Asia, right? And so there is this constant conflict, not just in terms of individual households trying to get rights, but communities trying to kind of negotiate, where do those customary or community rights fit in into this landscape of individual capitalist property rights. So I want to give the example of Zimbabwe, and this is based on a paper that written by Linosome and I just want to make sure that I'm still doing okay for time. And perhaps some of you are familiar with the fast track land program, very, very historic for multiple reasons. It was an attempt to de-racialize land ownership, and women really pushed for securing land in this case. But even though this was, a program that is historic and much needed, there is still sort of a lot of things that were quite undesirable, right? So as much as land, so what ended up happening in Zimbabwe is that in the process of this land reform, there were new regional and class production structures that emerged, which I won't get into the details of it. And they, part of the focus was that as land was being, or as there was some reduction in land concentration in Zimbabwe. Prior to that, it was mostly held by a few, rich white farmers. And so there was, to some degree, a reduction in that land concentration. But the focus was really on encouraging a new class of capitalists. So what we ended up, and what ended up happening is that, that there continued to be biases against women, both in terms of, in terms of how, this entire breadwinner model began to play a role, but also sort of in terms of even customary rights, like women had to kind of negotiate. And when I say biases against women, it doesn't mean that women didn't benefit at all, right? One of the things that we want to do is that even programs that are beneficial and are good, we always want to investigate, we want to kind of train a critical lens on those programs, and kind of make sure that what gaps remain that can be addressed, both with that particular program, but also for future policy making as well, right? So in the Zimbabwean case, there will continue to be biases against women, even as some women did get land titles and were able to successfully navigate sort of the landscape, both the legal landscape, but also the economic landscape. There were some biases against immigrants, and women's labor continued to be exploited. So, so what we observed in Zimbabwe is that as much as this land titling and land, is a potential pathway out of immiseration or immiserating conditions, extreme kind of economic deprivation, that this pathway itself was not available to all, right? And that that there was class differentiation. Like I said, that, there was a focus on encouraging a new class of capitalists. So there began to be sort of, even among Black farmers, this class differentiation based on how much land they received. And that for women, even as they received land titles, that it really, that the strength of their claims on land sort of, went hand in hand in terms of their claims and access to other resources and opportunities. And that deracialization of land ownership did not resolve the class, regional, or gender contradictions that had been produced by the colonial capitalist structure, right? So land continues to hold significance as an agrarian question, but it also holds significance because it serves as the basis of understanding the deepening inequalities on the basis of gender. So going back to what I mentioned, which is the agrarian question of gendered labor. So, in order to mitigate, some of the problems that land concentration had in Zimbabwe, the fast track land program would have had to also attend to other factors related to access and infrastructure and all of these other forms of peasant production, which wasn't necessarily addressed. So these insights, they kind of bear very specific implications for social reproductions. And it suggests that, we really, that what ended up happening with the fast track program is that kind of stabilized, the colonial era capitalist migrant labor structure, which depended on cheap production, cheap reproduction, and sustenance of the poorly remunerated wage labor, And so we have, part of the challenge is to continue to think also about who bears the burden of care and social reproduction, to also explore all of the different regimes and the changes needed for gender equity and food sovereignty, not just in terms of being on paper and looking good on paper, but really, what is the aim of such kinds of redistribution is to ensure that this gendered labor that often depends on land, how can this reproduction, how can that become less onerous and less immiserating, right? So how do we actually think about how do we think about not continuing to remain in a, in a situation where women are taking on this onerous burden, and how can we mitigate some of this burden, and perhaps bring about, and beyond mitigation, how can we kind of actually bring about gender equity? Yeah, so very quickly, let me run through two other things, land redistribution, and, is it transformative or is it, commodification of land? And then there are limitations to liberal framing of rights, and, how do we think about racialized capitalist patriarchy? What is the role of the state? How does, what is the land labor nexus? What are the everyday and negotiations and so on? We can come back to this if you are interested in the Q&A. I want to make sure that there's sufficient time for that. So I want to move on to, when I started, I said that, there are three questions for this session, right? Is wage economy the only source of livelihood? And in my work, or through my work and the work that others have done, and my joint work with Lynn, our argument is that it's not the only source of livelihood, that there are these multiple livelihoods, multiple labor processes that people engage in. And then we talked about, the different, what contributes to gender inequities in agrarian economies, and outside of land, titling, etc. The very fact that there isn't sufficient attention being paid to reproductive labor. And then I want to take these two questions and some of the answers that emerge from these two questions to talk about the third one. And this third one is really what I hope that you will take with you into the session after the coffee break, or the tea break, and in terms of the exercise, right? So, how important is it to account for this gendered labor, but also talk about class, race, caste, ethnicity, place, and you can add various elements to it, and using a social reproduction lens. So I want to, kind of build on, what I've done so far is try to focus it on kind of, specificities. And what I want to do now is bring it a little bit to the theoretical realm and think about social reproduction for the global South. Like, how do we think about social reproduction for the global South? So you have probably heard in these 2 days of conversations with experts, with each other, this notion of, production and reproductive labor, and what does it mean, and all of the debates, like, how do we actually think about it? I don't want to delve into those debates, but I want to draw from them, right? I want to draw from sort of some of the conversations that the feminists were having, the Marxist feminists were kind of engendered this debate about, household or domestic labor in the 1980s, and, all of the conversations about social reproduction that emerged from that. What I want to add to that is the third world perspective. So writing in the 1980s outside of Silvia Federici, and outside of Maria Della Costa and Selma James, and all of those people were also people who were writing about the global South. What we now talk about the global South, but they identified as third world feminists. And this included feminists like Maria Mies, Veronica Penhall-Thompson, Claudia von Verhoef, and they were really trying to understand women's labor under capitalism in the third world. And in some ways, they kind of questioned the analyses which centered wage labor in the domestic labor debates. And so they reframed the discussion by highlighting other modes of production and other labor forms. So this included women's non-waged work, contract work, peasants in the colonies, and they provided something called a subsistence perspective. So they kind of questioned this distinction between the productive and unproductive realms in, this distinction that was made by economists, by policymakers, and hence people adopted this distinction, where the unproductive realm was where reproductive work happened. The productive realm was where wage work happened. And so they questioned that the relevance of such distinctions for the global South. And of course, that questioning now is done even for countries in the global North, right? So, how do we even question this productive, unproductive? And it's not a very useful way to think about it, from my perspective, and others have written about it too. But Maria Mies adds on to it, and she provides this very scathing indictment of capitalism being fashioned out of patriarchy and systematically devaluing women's productive contributions. And in these productive contributions, she includes women engaged in domestic labor, farm workers, peasants, small traders, factory workers, etc., etc. Right. So I want to bring that to sort of a more contemporary context where thinking about sort of, women's work, exploitation, and so on. And so, Carmen, I'm sorry, I actually not coming back to coming to the contemporary yet. I just want to mention something that Carmen Diane-Dier also did for Latin America. She provided a critique very similar to that of Maria Mies, and she, argued that unlike analysis of domestic labor of housewives under industrial capitalism in countries of the global South, women's non-market labor actually lowers the value, lowers wages, and increases the surplus value or increases the amount of profits that can be extracted by capitalism, right? So, what she suggests is that the demand for women's paid labor was lower in those economies, and her analysis was based on the haciendas in Peru, and that she also argued, and this is very, very important because this is a point that she makes in the 1970s, and I believe I've shared that paper as a kind of recommend, like a kind of additional or an optional reading. But it's really fascinating, right? Because she's talking about this in the 1970s, and then more recently, Smriti Rao and I kind of look at this insight that I'm going to share with you for the context of India, right? Because what she argues is that peasant households, as much as we think of, and if you have dealt with official data, and I am more familiar with the data in India, and through some of the work that I've done with Linosome, some of the data in South Africa and Zimbabwe. But really, for those of you who are familiar with data from your own countries, you know that usually the classification that official data provide are of people based on the work that they do, and that if the predominant work that you do is you're a salaried worker, then you are classified as a salaried worker. And if you are the male head of the household, then your household itself gets classified as a household where of salaried workers. And this is definitely not true today. And Lynn and I have showed this for India. But it's, Carmen Dientier is writing in 1970s, argues that that wasn't true in Peru in that time either, right? So she says that peasant households or different members of peasant households could participate in multiple labor processes and hence engage in multiple class relations depending on their access to the means of production and reproduction, right? So really, what all of these writings, I'm just giving you a little flavor of it, suggests that women's work in the global south really needs to be understood in the overlapping prisons of production and reproduction, right? And Lourdes Beneria and Geeta Sen have also argued this for the case of India in the 1980s, right? And many others, Cindy Katz and others have also argued this for the global north. But again, my concern right now is to focus on the global south. So wages in the global south, right? Like, how do we understand this primacy of wages? And wages in the global south may be in some cases supplementary and not central to sort of the sum of all livelihoods that households engage in, right? So I'm not suggesting one or the other, but that we have to explore the possibilities of, what becomes central in our understanding of work, but our understanding of how households survive and how they flourish and all of that, right? So subsistence production and care work, some people have referred to this as familialism, that workers can fall back on the family even if wages are insufficient, right? But essentially, it subsidizes capitalist production and subsidizes profits. So, so in the context of India, for instance, more recently in 2020, Alpa Shah and Jens Lesch have argued that the work of reproduction depends on the work of all household members, right? That it's generational, it is gendered, and that the relations of exploitation that it gets enmeshed in interact in complex ways with gender, caste, and because they're writing about India, tribe-based oppressions, right? And we know that this can extend beyond the global south. We know that it also, you can also apply this to the global north as well. But the idea is that this productive and reproductive are not separate spheres except for capital, right? So for capital, making this distinction between what is production and what is reproduction makes sense. But I want to, I just missed a slide, I think. I apologize. I wanted to talk about Bridget O'Laughlin's work. Talking about it in the context of Mozambique, she argues that these separate spheres of conceptualization make sense from the viewpoint of capital, but because capital refuses the responsibility of reproduction for living labor, it consumes the process of the labor that it consumes in the process of production. So it doesn't care what happens to workers. It doesn't care what happens to those who are engaged in labor, engaged in work, but are not waged. And it is more than happy to compromise both the immediate subsistence of the working people, but as well as the long-term existence of the working people, right? And this burden of care, like who is actually stepping forward to take that on, right? To the extent that the state has put in place a social safety net, that's great, but we know that's not entirely true in many countries in the global south, right? So this is evident in the ways in which we we continue to see unemployment, the ways in which wages tend to be below survival, the unsafe working conditions that characterize sort of economies in diverse contexts. So wage income is an important contribution to the reproduction of living labor, but focusing on wage labor overlooks how conditions of work themselves consume the bodies of workers and compromise reproduction of labor, and that is what Bridget O'Loughlin says. But I want to add, and I apologize, I will walk you through this thing, is that if we want to think about all the different ways in which social reproduction occurs, and this inner circle represents what happens with wage labor, whereas the outer two circles represent what happened with non-wage labor. So the innermost circle sort of tells you that how is consumption possible? If we think about reproduction as, consuming at least to the threshold, right? Meeting the threshold level of consumption. And here I'm interested mostly in the working classes. Then we know that wage labor provides some wages, which allows households and individuals to purchase some commodities, and those commodities can be consumed. But anyone who's paid any attention to economies in the global south knows that consumption doesn't just come from what is possible through wage labor. That consumption comes from all of the ways in which non-wage labor also participates, right? So whether that is care work, right, engaging in kind of, active care, or we are talking about home-based work, or we are talking about sort of the myriad forms of informal production and reproduction activities that people undertake within their households, and that forms the outer two circles, right? So to some degree, non-wage labor is mediated by state and other forms of social structures, right? So the state kind of allows you access to means of production, land, or it allows you access to forests, and hence you can produce, or if it doesn't allow, then you have to find ways, you have to struggle, etc. Social structures play a very similar role in terms of access, in terms of what are the opportunities, and all of this is mediated by consumption of nature. And some of this fruits of this non-wage labor go back into producing commodities, and that becomes the second circuit, whereas some kind of stay in the realm of direct consumption and what we understand as production for, or subsistence production, or production for consumption. So these circuits, they present a stylized representation of the labors, or the different labors of social reproduction. So as much as we think of reproductive labor as domestic labor, as care work, what I am arguing is that it's all of it from the perspective of the working people. We really have to understand the entire set of labors that they are engaged in. Right. And, so for instance, so we have to not only talk about all of the labors that they're engaged in, but that this stylized representation can vary across class, it can vary across a race, it can vary across ethnicity, or, gender, and so on. And so we have to think about all of the differences that contribute to how these different circuits operate in a specific context. So I want to give you an example of this, right? So in the work that Lynn Osomi and I have done, in one of the papers, we compare women's participation in the labor force in South Africa versus women's participation in the labor force in India. And what we find is that, or what everyone knows is that in India, over time, women's participation in the labor force has been declining. So for those of you who don't know, labor force represents everyone who is either working or those who are not working but want to work, right? So they're actively looking for a job. So in India, over time, since the 1980s, this labor force participation has seen a downward trend. In South Africa, on the other hand, we find that women's labor force is increasing. So India and South Africa represent two very different cases, right? They have different histories, yes, both colonized by the British, but then, their historical their histories are different, right? Their paths have been different. And we see this difference in women's labor force participation. But what we argue in that paper is that despite that, in the South African case, women are participating, women's higher participation in the labor force is because they are facing economic deprivation, or what we call as immiseration, or what we refer to as immiseration. It's not a term that we coined, but that's the term we use. And in India, women's declining labor force participation is not declining to sit at home and enjoy, watching television and enjoy nature. That women's declining participation in the labor force is because they're engaging in non-wage labor that is not being accounted for, and is engaged in the labor of reproductive labor, of labor that ensures that the household reaches some level of consumption. So both are different expressions to conditions of immiseration, right? So as much as, yes, there are different contexts, we begin to see that if you think about it in the context of these circuits of social reproduction, that in the South African case, women's participation in the innermost circle, the wage labor, is much higher, whereas in the Indian case, women's participation in non-wage labor is much higher. But ultimately, in both cases, what they're trying to do is get the household to some level of, consumption, some kind of minimum level of being able to exist, if at all flourish. So what are the implications of this? And I'll try and wrap up in the next 5 minutes or so, so we leave some time for conversations, is how do we understand, and Bridget O'Loughlin kind of poses this question, right? How do we understand? And, if we understand social reproduction this way, our goal is not just to understand, our goal is to understand and then organize, right? And that organize could be ground level movements for those of us who are academics. It could be writing for those of us who are policymakers. It could be influencing policies, influencing the ways in which discourses occur, the ways in which we people begin to think, right? So how do we organize around the relations between class, gender, and race in particular moments of struggle, right? And here, I want to talk about it as in struggle for social reproduction. I don't have time to go over some of this, but I have offered you a reading by Lynn Osome, where she talks about sort of, there's a long and rich history of struggles in Africa, but also Asia and Latin America. And I've given you Lynn Osome's article as, one possible reading. And the reasons and the ways in which these struggles occur are very varied, right? And varied not just across space, not just across places and continents, but varied across time as well, right? What worked in 1950s doesn't work now. What worked before COVID doesn't work anymore, right? So the question is, what, if we come to contemporary times, what are people resisting in contemporary times, and what are they fighting for? So I want to go back to sort of the story that I started with, right? Jamlo Makdam's life, the 12-year-old girl who lost her life, because of sheer, everything, right? Like the failure of society, failure of the state, the failure of, capitalist production, the failure of, the ability, it was a crisis of, an extreme crisis of social reproduction, right? So the media did not adequately report on, what the specific conditions of her life were. I mean, there were other reports of it, right? But what we do know is that she suffered, and her family and her community suffered from insufficient employment, low wages, both because she was a girl, but a child, as well as the fact that she belonged to a very marginalized, economically and socially marginalized community, an Adivasi or a tribal community in central India, right? So the state abdicated its role. Her employers abdicated their role, and society as a whole abdicated their role, right? So what we, and why did she, as a 12-year-old, travel so far to work, pretty, not a low wage, not a sort of pleasant job, and that has to do, as much as it has to do with production, it also has to do with reproduction. So when we talk about the global South, there is a tendency, in most literature, there's a tendency to separate class struggles from the struggle of social reproduction. And we can challenge this for all economies in general, but particularly in the global South, we, it's really, that doesn't square up. That these class struggles, these economic struggles that people are engaged in are very much intertwined with the struggles of social reproduction because of the crisis of social reproduction that people have been experiencing. It is not new, but it feels acute at this point, right? So Nancy Fraser, very quickly, I just want to say, she often talks about the boundary struggles, and she talks about how, boundary struggles are, they separate the economy from polity, they separate production from reproduction and humans from non-human nature. But really, both for the global South and global North, but particularly global South, the crisis of reproduction goes beyond boundary struggle. That these contradictions inherent in our economic system manifest themselves simultaneously as economic, social, ecological, and political crises of social reproduction, right? So, Jamlo Maktam's is one sort of instance of it, but across the global South, we know that under an international neoliberal regime, that women's struggle and the struggle of the working people have manifested in differences in working women's labor force participation rate, the story I just talked about. It has resulted in long working days in some places. It has resulted in declining labor share, and it has resulted in the rise of flexible and precarious forms of work in the global South as well as the global North, right? So, so how do we think about these, again, these crises of social reproduction? We can think about it, so it is in capital's interest to influence the working classes to adopt those levels of consumptions and those patterns of consumptions that mitigate crises for capital, that are conducive to profit generation, right? But not necessarily taking into account the crisis for the working people themselves. And yet, the control of capital on waged or non-waged labor processes itself is not absolute, right? So if you talk about all of the rich kind of resistance that's emerging across the world, right? Whether that is in South Africa in 2021, the Indian farmers' strike of 2021, those are two examples of it, right? So how do we think about, there is a acute crisis of social reproduction, but alongside that there is a response, and that these responses, they reflect struggles of against the crises. They may not all be revolutionary in their potential, but they do represent an expression of people's kind of resistance. And it is up to us, for those of us who are working on this, to kind of support those struggles, to kind of think about how to theorize them, to, kind of influence policy, and to participate in the struggles where we can. So I'm going to end there. I want to thank, all the organizers, Juhi and Pamela and, Lynn for inviting me, and, hope the rest of you have a good rest of your week and have a good break. Take care.